So today I'm going to be explaining how to tune and set up your cars in Rush Rally 3. So to start with, I'm going to assume that you know basic vehicle terminology such as like understeer, oversteer, acceleration, all that stuff. Or mostly just that stuff. But anyway, so it's important to note with that a vehicle can have both understeer and oversteer at different parts of a corner and different stages of a corner. So some vehicles will tend to oversteer on entering a corner, but after entering a corner, on the exit of the corner, they'll tend to understeer. So it's noteworthy to consider that. I'll go into that more as we get into the tune. So drive bias, pretty fundamental. 50-50 works pretty well for most surfaces because that evenly distributes the power to the front tires and rear tires. However, 65-35 can also work just as well if your tune is designed to support it. Some tunes work really well with more rear wheel drive, whereas some work a lot better with more 50-50. Drive bias will, in general, having it further back like this will tend to cause the vehicle to slide when you apply power on the exit of a corner. Having it more forward will tend to make it understeer under power, depending on how the rest of your tune is, due to the fact that the front tires are trying to steer while also accelerating the vehicle. I, however, like to keep it about 50-50, so we'll install that. Then we'll go to tuning here. So final drive ratio basically controls the top speed of your vehicle. If you set it to like most stages, like 130 is more than enough. I keep it around about there because that tends to work pretty well for me because I like to use the manual transmission. If you have a shorter stage with a lower top speed, you can set it to lower, but it'll mean you'll change gears a lot more often, which can be annoying if you're using manual transmission. Then we have spoiler angle here. This basically controls how much downforce your car has at speed. So if it's higher, then when you're going really fast, your car will have more grip. If it's lower, when you're going really fast, your car will have not as much grip. Sometimes it can be advantageous to set it lower. Most of the time I run it all the way at 45. I know some people like to run it at 30 degrees or so. That way they can power slide more corners and stuff like that, but I tend to keep it up by 45 or so. Then brake bias is basically how much brake force is applied to the front versus the rear. This will apply all the brakes to the front and none to the rear. This, all the brakes to the rear, none to the front. Typically, it's best to set this somewhere between 0.5 and 0.6. I like to set it usually to about 0.55. It really depends on the vehicle. You kind of have to play with the different values and drive the vehicle and stuff. So next we will go on to suspension. We'll work on both front and rear at the same time. So ride height controls how tall your suspension is. This first number, the 15 or 0.15 centimeters, is the actual height of the suspension system. And then the R here is the ride height, which is how far your vehicle is above the ground. So as you can see with it all the way up, front of the vehicle is much higher off the ground. With it all the way low, front of the vehicle is much closer to the ground. Typically for most stages, I like to just set this to max, and then I'll adjust the spring stiffness to bring the ride height down. Because one of the things with spring stiffness is the softer your spring stiffness is, the more your tires will sort of be stuck to the road all the time. Because if your spring stiffness is really stiff, then the tires will tend to like jump over small bumps and ruts and stuff like that, which tends to cause problems and reduce your grip. So then I'll lower down the stiffness to give me a ride height of around somewhere between 10 and 15 centimeters. In this case, we'll go with like 12 or so. So let's double check that. Get this a little bit lower. So that's about good. Now, anti-roll here is one of the main key characteristics of how your car performs. That basically links the left and right sides of the suspension so that your car doesn't, when you corner, just tilt to one side or the other. So with these values higher, it'll make the car corner at higher speeds generally, and it'll make it more responsive. However, at lower values, you'll have a little bit more grip on rough surfaces. And it's also noteworthy the fact that the relation of the front and rear anti-roll bars will affect the handling of the car. If your front anti-roll is really soft, while your rear is really stiff, it'll cause the car to oversteer and slide a lot more, as opposed to the other way around. Stiff front setup, soft rear setup will cause the car to understeer a lot. So I typically like to set this to about 20,000 newtons or like 15,000, somewhere around there. In this case, I'm going to set them both to be about the same, because with my tunes I find that works pretty well. So now we'll move on to this bump damping here. So bump damping effectively affects how your suspension handles bumps. So a stiffer bump damping will tend to make your suspension resist compressing. So it'll make it so that when you hit a bump, the whole vehicle kind of jumps over it, rather than the spring just compressing and allowing the tire to roll over the bump. So typically for more grip, you want this set much lower. However, with it set really low, that can make the car sort of feel sort of springy and bouncy and make it roll around a lot more aggressively. So typically I find it useful to set it relatively low. It is noteworthy though that bump damping, like anti-roll, if you set it to be different between the front and rear suspension, like for example stiff bump damping at the front, will tend to cause you to understeer, as opposed to stiff bump damping at the rear will cause you to oversteer, which is a trait that not many people consider or look at. Now, next is rebound damping. Rebound damping basically controls how quickly your suspension rebounds back to full ride height after it's compressed by a jump or something like that. If you set your rebound damping to be really low, it'll cause the car to kind of bounce back off the ground after a jump, which can make it extremely difficult to control. On the other hand, with it set really ridiculously high, after a jump, your car will kind of just stay stuck to the ground and slowly go back up to full ride height, which can mean that on a sequence of jumps or bumps, your car can kind of ratchet toward the ground and stay really low to the ground, which can cause you to scrape the frame on stuff. Typically, since the front and rear stiffness, as you can see, are different, which is due to the weight distribution of the car. Most cars in game are heavier at the front than at the rear. Typically, I like to set the rebound damping to be about equal to about 1/10 of the spring stiffness. So for 27,000 newtons, I'll set it to 2,700 newtons. And then the same for the rear. So that is your suspension setup. Now on to wheels. So camber is how tilted the wheel is. As you can see, that tilts the wheel up and down. With it about horizontal or at 0 degrees, which is vertical, it will tend to have really good straight line braking and straight line speed. However, it's not very stable. Having your front camber higher than your rear, because camber basically gives you grip in corners. So when you're going through a corner with a lot of grip, having higher camber will give you more cornering grip. However, if you push your camber values like crazy high, like 10 degrees or whatever, it'll affect your straight line braking and acceleration. Most of the time that's not hugely important in rally, but typically I like to set it to less than 5 degrees, but more than say 2 degrees or so. It's also noteworthy that it's typically good to not set the rear to have higher camber than the front. Typically, it's generally standard to run the front with more camber than the rear by a factor of 2 or maybe the same, but never more rear camber than front camber, as that'll cause the car to understeer through corners, which is generally undesirable, as it's easier to correct oversteer than understeer most of the time for experienced drivers. Now, toe. Basically, this affects how far in or out your tires are pointed. So if you can see it a little bit there. With positive toe, your front tires are pointed. Your tires are going to be pointed outward a little bit. With negative toe, they'll be pointed inward. So with negative toe, the front of the tires are closer together than the back of the tires. Typically, positive toe or negative toe will cause your vehicle to be more stable through corners. Negative toe will give you more responsive handling characteristics, so you can enter corners more suddenly, stuff like that. So typically I like to run it slightly positive on the front. The rear kind of does the same thing, but to a lesser extent since you're not steering, so typically I leave it about the same or set it to 0. Then wheel size. Wheel size has a huge effect on how your car handles, due to the fact that it increases your top speed without affecting your acceleration, as you can see. So if you set it really small, it reduces your top speed. However, what you can do is you can set it relatively high, say, I like to run it about 31.5 or so, something up by there. And then you can reduce your drive ratio. Will reduce your drive ratio, and now your acceleration time has gone down. So like if you max it out, you can get the same top speed without really sacrificing acceleration time very much. Typically I don't run this quite that high. I typically run it more down, like around like 31 or so, 31.3, something like that. And then I'll adjust my drive ratio again to make it like in that 31-30 range. So with that, that is basically all the tuning characteristics to these cars.